This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Men in White, The Gutsy Against All Odds Return of Penn State Football. The author is Chris Raymond. For decades, Penn State football stood for greatness on the field and off. Under legendary Coach Joe Paterno, the program was known for doing things the right way, or as Paterno dubbed it, success with honor. But on Saturday, November 5th, 2011, everything the team stood for came crashing down. The horrific crimes of former assistant Jerry Sandusky are now well known, but what's often overlooked is the heroism of the young men who rallied to raise Penn State football from the ashes. Guys like Christian Hackenberg, John Urschel, Saquon Barkley, Carl Nassib, and Trace McSorley. Acclaimed writer Chris Raymond paints an amazing behind the scenes portrait of their inspiring journey with this new book, Men in White. Chris has covered sports, politics, and pop culture for 30 years, in addition to various longtime roles at ESPN. Raymond has also been on staff and written and edited for Details, Esquire, and GQ. Makes his home in beautiful Westchester County, New York. Happy to have for the very first time Chris Raymond join me here on Speaking of Writers. Chris, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I appreciate you giving me the chance to come on.
Chris, was this one of the most incredible comebacks in sports history?
I really think it is, yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, when you look at where the program was in 2011 when this story broke, the national media descended on the campus. The longtime head coach, the athletic director, the president of the university were all suddenly let go. It looked like the whole thing was going to collapse. And when the NCAA came back and issued sanctions, people were talking about a death penalty. Anybody who knows about SMU football knows that that program has never recovered. So for Penn State to come back and win a Big Ten championship 5 years later, the odds, against that were astronomical. So I do think it was a remarkable, comeback because of these players. They also had some great, good fortune in the quality and some of the talent they got over those next 4 years to lead the team back into that Big Ten championship.
We'll talk about some of those players. The turning point here. Now, you focus really from 2012 to 2016, this period.
That's right.
What were the two key games in 2016 that were the turning point?
Yeah, I think the Minnesota game in 2012, or sorry, in 2016, a lot of people may overlook now that, the team started off 2-2 that year, including a very embarrassing loss to Michigan. So when they went into that Minnesota game at halftime, there were literally people in the stands calling for James Franklin's head. They wanted him to be let go at that moment. The players heard that, they were like, oh my gosh, we have this happening like on our home field. We have our own fans kind of pushing for our coach to be dismissed, disappointed with the way the season goes. And it was a long touchdown pass right at the start of the second half. They sort of ignited the comeback in that game, and they really never looked back there. And so a few games later, 2 games later, they were playing against Ohio State, which was the number 2 team in the nation at that moment, at home in a classic whiteout setting at Penn State. And they won that game with a blocked kick that still goes down as probably the greatest play in Penn State history. It's certainly the most significant play in Penn State history. And that allowed them to slip past Ohio State and get into that Big Ten championship game. And that's when you really knew, like, okay, this program's going to be okay. They're able to compete with the very top teams in the nation.
Yeah, the victory over Wisconsin there in the Big Ten championship. After Paterno gets let go, Coach Bill O'Brien gets hired. What was the impact of Coach Bill O'Brien on this program at that time?
Yeah, you look at programs like Nebraska that's still trying to replace Tom Osborne, right? Florida State that went a long time trying to figure out how to replace Bobby Bowden. The fact that Penn State hired, Bill O'Brien, came in right in the, behind Joe Paterno, this legendary coach. I think Bill was 38 at the time. This was his first head coaching job. Granted, he was coaching for the New England Patriots and coaching Tom Brady, so he kind of knew what he was doing, but he hadn't coached in college football in a while too. So he had to kind of hit the ground right away. And then in in July of that year, when things had seemingly settled down and the NCAA came in and issued sanctions, the scholarship, reductions were significant there. The fact they couldn't play in a post game was significant, but at one of the sides, and this was probably a noble attempt from the NCAA, but they basically absolved the players of all obligations to the school. So they were released from their scholarships and they could have transferred anywhere in the country. And the result of that announcement alone meant that rival coaches were calling within minutes, trying to kind of pluck players away. Illinois sent 8 coaches to campus. They were literally walking up through the player housing and knocking on doors, trying to recruit players away. They were sitting in restaurants downtown State College, trying to recruit players away. And it really looked like the whole thing could collapse. And Bill was the one that really not only sort of made those players feel comfortable in coming back, but I think he had the good, insight to kind of lean on Michael Mauti and Michael Zordich, 2 of the seniors from that team, and trust them, brought them in really into his office, day after day, and kind of listen to what they were saying about which players were likely to go and which were likely to stay. He allowed them to call a press conference on their own, right? And say, hey, one man didn't tear this program down. One man didn't build this program. One man's not going to tear this program down. And appear before the whole nation at a time when the president of the university, the board of trustees were kind of scared to kind of step forward and become the face of the program. He allowed those players to kind of step forward and do that. So he had, I talked to the strength and conditioning coach that he hired. He was like the first person on campus there. And that guy said, you look at Bill O'Brien, again, 38 years old, first head coaching job. He had to make some very difficult decisions over the 2 seasons he was there. And he did not make one false move in that time. So it is a significant thing.
And those 2 players, Mauti and Zordich, had Penn State in their DNA too.
Yes. And that goes back to sort of the foundation that Joe Paterno had laid for the program, right? He was there for 50 years. And the impact of that is you have basically had 50 years worth of players who had gone through the same experience under Joe Paterno. So Michael Mauti and Michael Zordich had fathers who had played at Penn State in the 80s. They were kind of raised with that success with honor, ideal. And they understood what that meant. And I think that's why they were able to kind of come forward and say, hey, let's separate the crimes of this monster, Jerry Sandusky, from, what this program has stood for 50 years. And, I had argued this myself in the days afterwards. If you throw the whole thing out, right, it's a great tragedy because I do think that program operated with that ideal. And I think that ideal worked. And, as an alum, I could not have been more thankful for those players stepping forward and saying, hey, yeah, there's something here that's worth saving. The work of, 50 years of players, is worth saving here. And we're willing to be the ones who step forward and do that.
Chris, who were some of the other players that stood out to you?
Boy, I think, Christian Hackenberg is probably the one who paid the greatest price for the scholarship reductions over those next few years. And he certainly could have, nobody would have blamed him if he turned and walked away. He hadn't even, joined the team yet when those sanctions were announced. He was just coming back from a quarterback camp for high school quarterbacks. When he heard on ESPN that the program had received those sanctions, there were a lot of people trying to, convince him to kind of turn and go to a different program. But I think, you look at Saquon Barkley, who showed up as a in-state recruit, certainly not even the best running back that they had recruited in that class, and then just become this like world-class talent, not only just a world-class talent and somebody who like showed, highlights almost from the very beginning on the football field. But he's the kind of guy that would stay afterwards and kind of walk around the stadium shaking hands and signing autographs for people. He was very, very approachable, had a great smile, and really, in the weight room was almost a monster in the weight room. He was determined to get every single one of those records for running backs. And so his work ethic really kind of had left an impact on the players that were there. And then I think you look at Trace McSorley as well. An undersized quarterback that came in. Nobody else wanted to put him at the quarterback position. James Franklin was going to do that at Vanderbilt. And then when he moved from Vanderbilt to Penn State, he said, yeah, come on here and do that. And I think when you look in 2016 at what Trace McSorley and Saquon Barkley were able to do on a football field and the way they conducted themselves off the field, you couldn't have asked for a better ambassadors for the sport of college football, much less Penn State. The things that team accomplished, I think, on TV week after week was a great endorsement, like I said, for the game of college football.
What was your research like for this? Obviously, all the interviews, the book is filled with quotes from all of these players and trainers and staff.
It's a great question. Something I had to kind of think about from the very beginning. So, as you pointed out, I decided I wasn't even going to look at what happened in 2011 and try and get caught up in the Jerry Sandusky scandal, because I don't think we'll ever know who knew what at Penn State. The heat was so, intense in the beginning. The push for heads to roll meant that nobody was going to come forward, and we were never going to get answers to that. But I also knew, reporting on this from Westchester, right, 3.5 hours from campus. I knew I'd covered the program when I was there as a student back in the late 80s. I knew many of the people who covered it, but I didn't know the players and they didn't know me. So I didn't want to kind of go in there and presume to say I could get that whole story and get every last detail right. And so I made the decision to make this into an oral history. And that meant the players were going to tell the story in their own voices. And that allowed me to kind of convince some of those players, like, this is it. I want you to be, it's going to come in your voice, so I want you to tell me the story, and I'm going to sort of stitch those together. And I think that worked way, way better than I expected. It also allowed me to kind of go in and then mine a lot of material that was there online. So there are transcripts from press conferences going back years at Penn State. There were video clips from interviews in the locker room, on the sidelines, clips of sideline interviews from the TV programs. I was able to kind of go in and mine all of that stuff, and find the themes that made the book work. I knew the 2012 season was awesome. I knew the 2016 season was very dramatic, but I was going to have to stitch in what happened in 2012, 2013, and 2014, when you had a lot of losing seasons, right? They didn't lose on the record wise. The remarkable thing is they actually never had a losing season at that time, but there was certainly more losing than Penn State fans were accustomed to. And it was able to kind of mine that material to kind of find out what was happening in those moments. I used podcasts a great deal too.
Mm. And as you stitched everything together, did you find some common themes about the program?
That was actually fairly easy to do. I often started off by just asking these players, tell me your story, how you ended up at Penn State, and what your time was like, what those seasons were like, and then kind of moments from games that stood out to you. And I was really struck by how many themes kind of started to repeat themselves. So I started off by talking to players who were not the star players. I started off with some of the walk-ons. And when I started to learn about what the walk-on experience was like, I was like, I had to do a chapter on this. There's no question about that. When I got into some of the tactics that they needed to use, they were using walk-ons, they were using true freshmen, they were actually, using players from tryouts. One of my favorite stories in the book was a kid who tried out as a long snapper, and he reported to campus like any other freshman. He was there in the stands for the first few games of the season. And then in a tryout, he was working out for the tryout in the East Halls where all the freshmen stay, with other freshmen, not with football players from Penn State. And when he got on to the team, the first game he was eligible to play for was on the road in Indiana. So it turned out that his very first game in Beaver Stadium, playing in front of the home crowd, was that 4 overtime game, the whiteout game against Michigan in 2013. And he was telling me literally the first snap he had, they were wearing the white jerseys. He was looking back between his legs, and it was just a sea of white. He literally had to kind of snap the football and hope that it went in the right place. So that's the kind of stories that I really loved in this book. Is it's easy to kind of think about the stars from that, but there are 120 players, 95 to 120 players on the team. And a lot of these people were not going on to the NFL. They were actually going to kind of sell cars, work in construction, doing regular jobs. but they had this moment in time where they got to contribute to this team and this program, and they took a lot of pride in that team and that program, and were determined to kind of say, hey, we can do this. We can show the world that you can still do it right and win football games.
And speaking of the program, let's fast forward to today. We're just about on the eve of the new college football season here as we record this. Where is the program today, Chris? Good shape?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, I think there's a lot of frustration. You see a lot from the fans because they haven't won, even a Big Ten conference title since that 2016 season. They've been talking about being a playoff team, but they haven't been able to sneak past Ohio State or Michigan. But they've given them games, both of those teams significant games. I think the playoff had been confined to just 4 teams, and when you have to kind of get past Ohio State and Michigan every year, that makes it sort of difficult to become one of those 4 teams. So now that they've expanded the format, I do think that they're right there. They're going to be in the mix. They have the talent. It really sort of comes down to that those intangibles that make you into a winning team. And that's what was interesting about, talking to those players from 2016. Cause like I said, 4 games in, they were 2-2, they hadn't quite learned how to win yet. And it was a new offensive coordinator who just boosted their confidence. It was a few players that stepped up and said, hey, I'm going to make the play in that game. It was almost a different player every week. And it was a quarterback and a running back that were like all world. Well, if you look at what Penn State has right now, they have all of those elements there. So it really comes down to, like, are those players, is somebody on those teams willing to step up each week and make the difference in those games that they have.
The book is Men in White. It's a great book. The Gutsy Against All Odds Return of Penn State Football. The author is Chris Raymond. Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about the book. I appreciate the opportunity to do that.
And it is available now. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast.